So this is our last Wednesday seminar of the semester, so thank you for making it through. So today's speaker is Levi Summer. He's actually a new member here at Stony Brook, a research scientist, where he arrived in September. Levi, I'll tell you a little bit about his background. So Levi got his bachelor's in physics in the Northeast at Gordon College until he decided to move out to the Mountain West and did his master's and PhD in atmospheric science at Colorado State University. After spending some time at Colorado, he went off to work on his postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg, where he was for a few years before actually moving back to the States and to Princeton University as a research scientist, and joined with Princeton and the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory in Princeton. And lucky enough for us, Levi joined SoMAS here in September as a research scientist, kind of continuing a lot of the work he was doing, which he's going to present on actually today, with the work that he's doing mostly at Princeton, which is focusing on clouds and sensitivity in the GFDL model. And his work here at Stony Brook actually starts to focus on looking at clouds and climate sensitivity in a variety of climate models and actually using more idealized approaches. And I think we'll probably find out in his talk today that these interactions are very complex, even in the full models, and so trying to understand them oftentimes requires stripping back some complexity. And that's the type of work that we do here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Levi.
Thank you, Kevin. All right. Thank you for coming. I'm happy to be here, and looking forward to telling you a little bit of what I have been doing, and then envisioning what will come with future research as well. So as Kevin mentioned, as you can see from the title, I'm going to discuss the clouds in the newest sort of generation of the GFDL climate models that were being developed over the course of the last few years and were just completed last year mostly, and the documentation was sort of completed last year and part of this year. So this is these experiments were done about a year ago, but the data is just now coming out. It's just now starting to be analyzed, and so it's kind of an exciting opportunity to get a first look at some of these questions. So David Painter was the primary person I worked with on this project of CFMIP at GFDL. So there's, I apologize in advance if there's too many acronyms. Both the CMIP project and GFDL and NOAA all really like acronyms. And so there's all these acronyms like GFDL and CFMIP. CFMIP is the Cloud Feedback Model Intercomparison, and that's just, it's an intercomparison project within the CMIP project itself. So CMIP is comparing lots of climate models. This is the 6th round that we're just about finished with now, that you're going to all start to see papers coming out analyzing CMIP 6 models in a lot of different contexts. And CFMIP is a smaller part of that focuses on cloud feedbacks. So almost all of the experiments I'll talk about and most of the diagnostic tools related to clouds are part of this cloud feedback comparison project. And so David Painter helped a lot with that. And then there was a number of other people at GFDL that will be acknowledged on the paper when this is all finalized. The motivation can start with some fairly simple questions. The first one is, what is the sensitivity of Earth's climate to anthropogenic forcing? So this is a question that spans lots of different fields. Obviously, we're going to be looking at it from the context of clouds. Specifically, do clouds matter? I've been sort of privileged over the last number of years to work with people where this is sort of obvious, to them at least, that clouds do matter. You never have to make that argument. They're important for climate sensitivity, and they're very interesting. And I think this department is broad enough to where I might have to work a little bit harder to convince you all that clouds matter and that they're interesting. Hopefully by the end of the talk, you will think that they are. This, by the way, is a picture from the International Space Station. And so this shows a lot of the interesting complexity that's present in clouds. And we'll talk more about the details of that. But I think this illustrates a lot of the interesting features that will become clearer as we go forward. And then specifically, what role do the clouds play in the Earth's climate? So clouds do matter. As many of you are probably aware, some of the obvious ways in which clouds matter is rain comes from clouds, right? So all the different ecological impacts of rain and snow and the other things obviously are connected to clouds. So they contribute to failed forecasts. They contribute to successful forecasts. They're the dominant factors of the hydrological cycle and also to severe weather. So a lot of times scientists are focused on other components of the climate system, but the clouds are sort of always in the background driving things as far as the atmosphere is going. And then for the last couple of decades, we've started to get a clearer picture of how important clouds are to the spread of climate sensitivity. There was a report that many of you are familiar with, the Stony report from 1979, that sort of gave an initial boundary for the climate sensitivity due to anthropogenic forcing. And in the last 20 years, we've started to realize how much of that range of climate sensitivity uncertainty is actually due to clouds. And then some of these later studies actually pinned that down a little bit more to the low-level clouds in the atmosphere. When you look across the whole range of climate models, we realize that there's a huge spread of clouds and how those models simulate clouds, and that contributes to the uncertainty of the sensitivity. So this is my last plug for why clouds are important. This is a complicated figure many of you have probably seen before in terms of the energy balance. The main thing to notice is that there's a huge amount of energy coming from the sun, 340 watts per meter squared. And there's basically that same amount leaving the Earth. The Earth is close to imbalance. It's not dramatically warming or dramatically cooling on a day-to-day basis. So we have here 100 watts per meter squared reflected, and here we have 239 watts per meter squared that's being re-emitted in the long wave. So the point here is that the balance, the top of the atmosphere imbalance, is less than 1 watt per meter squared. It's much less than 1% of the incoming radiation and the outgoing radiation. It's the same at the surface. So even though we're looking at cloud changes of a few percentage in cloud fraction, it doesn't take much to change this imbalance, which is 0.6 watts per meter squared at the surface or at the top of the atmosphere. So a lot of the details of clouds and how they're important are kind of embedded in this figure, but keep that in mind, that the imbalance is less than 1 watt per meter squared. So small changes in clouds can make a big difference. So for the rest of my talk, this is the outline. I'll start by looking at clouds in a particular GFDL CMIP6 experiment called AMIP. I'll explain in detail what that exactly is. And I'll emphasize comparing clouds in that experiment to satellite data. And that's a little bit of a new method for the GFDL models. There hasn't been a lot of comparison with GFDL models with satellite data in the past. There's been some, but they've mostly relied on other data sources. And then the second part of the talk, I'll talk about the sensitivities of the simulated climates within GFDL models across a hierarchy of models. So AMIP is the Atmospheric Model Intercomparison Project. So throughout this talk, when I say that, just know that it's an atmosphere-only climate model. There's no ocean involved. And in particular, what we do is we take the observed sea surface temperatures over this period, 1979 to 2014, and we force the atmospheric model with those observed sea surface temperatures. So it's pretty realistic, but there's no ocean, and we shouldn't be happy when we look at the surface temperature and realize that's what we observed, because we're giving that to the model. We also give the model the carbon dioxide concentrations and how they change every year. We give it things like methane and other greenhouse gases. So we give the model basically what we know occurred in the last 36-year period, and then we see what the model does. So what we don't give the model is precipitation. We don't give the model temperature within the atmosphere or relative humidity or wind. So the dynamics are a response to these forcings. The precipitation and the distribution of precipitation is a response to the sea surface temperature. So this is a good opportunity to check how good of a job the model's doing in simulating clouds, given the correct greenhouse gases and given the correct sea surface temperatures. So that's going to be our observational check, and then this will go into more future experiments. These are some of the documentation papers. There's 4 papers that go into really kind of extreme detail about these new models. These 2 here are about the atmospheric model. This is the climate-coupled model, and then this is more specifically focused on climate sensitivity and transient climate response. Okay, so this is sort of the first look at some clouds that came out of the model. So the atmospheric model forced during the AMIP period, the last 36 years, at least going up to 2014, is on the top. And on the bottom is data from the MISR satellite. This is all clouds below 3 kilometers, so this is all low-level clouds. Remember, I mentioned that low-level clouds are quite important, and then it's further separated. On the left here is thick clouds, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, and on the right are thin clouds. And the global mean values are given here. So for the MISR satellite, low-level clouds that are thick, there's a 21% cloud fraction observed. during this time period. And this is what the model produces during the AMIP time period. So I think overall it looks pretty good when you look at it this way, in that the broad pattern is more or less correct. We have these maximum regions here where there are stratocumulus clouds. There's a lot more clouds in the Southern Ocean than there are in the tropics as far as low-level clouds. But you see that the numbers are different, so there's a bias of 4% cloud fraction here. The model is producing 4% less cloud fraction than observed during that time period. And it gets worse when you go to the thin clouds. So with the thin clouds, there's a bias of 11% here. So we're seeing that AM4 produces fewer than observed clouds, and that bias is more extreme with the thin clouds.
I have a question.
Yep.
So wouldn't it be better to compare at the same time?
That would be better in some ways, but it sort of speaks to different questions. So one of the questions would be the variability on a year-to-year basis.
Yeah, because
So
maybe it's not an error, it's just very.
I would argue, basically just from what I've seen, this is a true error, but I think the questions of variability on a year-to-year basis are very important, and they're interesting questions. And as we look at different observational products, that issue will come up as well, because the different satellites have different time periods. And so I think that
But the model can be run for different time periods.
yeah, so we have the data from the model for just this time period. That's fine, we could do that. And so I think that would be important if one of our primary focuses was the variability on a year-to-year basis or on a shorter time period. I can produce that plot and I can show you. I don't think it's going to change the results, but I think it's a point worth noting. So this is the way that when I show cloud fraction results from the AMIP run, it's for the whole AMIP period. And I think it's worth thinking about, and in some cases going into details about the exact period. But overall, I'm trying to get an idea of the climatology, if you can say climatology for such a short period of time. So it's a good point. So I'm going to talk possibly a little bit more than you care to hear about satellites and satellite simulators, so that you know what we're looking at, because this is a little bit of a novel diagnostic tool that CFMIP has developed, and I think it will be important going forward with evaluating climate models. So we'll go into some of the details, not yet, but soon. So this is another form of satellite data. This comes from the Ceres satellite data set, and this is just to illustrate kind of what was driving part of the development phase for the GFDL models. So here we see that there's too few clouds according to the observational period given here. But there are many ways to increase low-level clouds in a model, and we are aware of that. And so there are many parameterizations that we could change in the way the clouds are dealt with in the model that would increase the low-level clouds. But it would change other things in the climate. So it's sort of a decision that usually is made in terms of individuals or a team of people talking about what decisions you want to prioritize, whether or not low-level clouds are your main priority or something else. And one of the driving priorities for the GFDL models most recently was the top of the atmosphere radiative fluxes. Part of that is because that's some of our best observed data for the Earth system, is at the top of the atmosphere, the fluxes of energy going into and out of the system. We know those numbers quite well. We know those numbers actually much better than we know the amount of precipitation that falls or the exact amount of clouds that exist at different heights. So we prioritize that. Here is the flux that was produced in the AMIP model, and on the right are the observations, which, when plotted this way, looks pretty good. You have to look at a difference plot to see really where we're coming up short. But overall, you can see we get the basic pattern and the basic quantity of fluxes into and out of the top of the atmosphere correct. And then this is just to show you 3 different generations of GFDL models. AM2, which was roughly 20 years ago, 15 to 20. AM3, which was more like 10. And then AM4, which is the most current. And you can see that the pattern, the bias pattern, so this is where we get it wrong. In some places too little, and in some places too much flux. The bias pattern is decreasing as we develop the model, and the absolute value is also decreasing. So the bias here in watts per meter squared at the top of the atmosphere is now less than 1 watt per meter squared. We're very happy with that, because in the past it was several watts per meter squared. And then this is the root mean square error, so that gives you a measure of the spatial pattern of the error. That's also decreasing quite significantly. So this is one of the things that we were quite happy with. And this is one of the things that we prioritized over specifically tuning to get, say, low-level cloud fraction correct. So I think we can do better in the future with clouds. They were not the primary focus of the optimization of the model. I can already tell I'm going a little bit slow, so I'm going to basically skip this. But this is just to say that there were two different versions of the atmospheric radiative flux data, and the second version came out right as we were basically finishing our results, and the model was not going to be retuned. And this is to show that it doesn't change the results very much. So the observational constraints due to radiative flux at the top of the atmosphere still show that the model compares very favorably with that. So most of the data I'm using to compare the GFDL model clouds with is satellite data, and most of those satellites are coming from the NASA so-called A-train that has been flying for a number of years. And so there's a lot of different satellites here, and there are a lot of differences between those satellites. Some of them have active sensing versus passive sensing. That's whether or not they're actually sending like a LiDAR beam down to hit the clouds and bounce back up, or if they're just basically observing the radiation and the light that's coming up to the satellites. They have slightly different life histories when they were launched and when they are finished. The detection algorithms, and this is one of the big factors, is different in each of the different satellites. And also their location over the globe at a particular time varies, especially when the satellites, like the ISKIP product that I'll show you, that's not part of the A-train, so that is a combination of satellites in different regions. So there's all of these differences in satellites. These are the products that I'm going to actually analyze the clouds according to. And they have different strengths because the satellites have different characteristics. So for example, ISKIP is the oldest satellite product for the purposes of clouds that we have. It was launched, I think, in the early 80s. So we have roughly 25 years of data from ISKIP, and that's much longer than any of these other more sophisticated satellites. So that's the strength of ISKIP. The detection algorithm isn't that great, but it's a longer record. MODIS is very similar to ISKIP, but it has a little bit more of a sophisticated detection algorithm. So this does better with high clouds. MISR does better with low clouds, and Calypso measures the cloud height directly. So this is mostly just to point out that we can't just take one satellite and say this is the ground truth, and that's what we're going to drive the entire model development towards. Because the different satellites give us different so-called ground truths. We have to realize that the actual cloud climatology of Earth is something that none of the satellites are observing perfectly, and the models are not getting perfectly. So understanding the different strengths of the different tools is important. That's why I looked at the low clouds with MISR and didn't focus on the high clouds. We can look at the high clouds, certainly, but it's better to focus on the low clouds. So then I'm also going to talk about satellite simulators, and that's the data that I'm telling you comes from AM4, the climate model, is coming from a satellite simulator, which is part of the code within the model, and I'll explain why we need that. It's because satellites measure the intensity of radiation. Satellites don't measure cloud condensate directly. They don't measure cloud phase directly. They don't measure temperature directly. They measure the radiation that's coming up to them. And then we have to write sophisticated algorithms to take what the satellites measure and actually translate that into the quantities that we want to know about, in particular for clouds. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And that's specifically not how global climate models that's not how global climate models work. Global climate models I mean, we make them how we want them. And so it doesn't depend on an algorithm that's going to translate radiation into cloud phase. We just compute the cloud phase within the model. So imagine a satellite orbiting over a global climate model. What would it see? That's the question that the satellite simulators answer. So what's happened is a lot of the people that have developed the algorithms for the satellites themselves then developed a piece of software code that we plug into the GCM that tries to do the same type of algorithm. It tries to do the same types of calculations to get a more fair comparison between the satellite itself and the GCM. So that's what a satellite simulator is. It's still model data. It's just sort of a black box within a black box, which is unfortunate, but useful. So this is the picture I already showed you from MISR. These are the strengths that I already told you, but each of these satellite products also have weaknesses. Calypso attenuates quickly as it's looking down into the different cloud layers. MISR doesn't detect anything over land, so you see that we have no data from miles over land. So as we're interpreting the cloud products, it's actually very difficult to figure out exactly what target to drive towards. And I think this has led to a lot of climate model development not really utilizing satellite simulators or satellite data as much as they could, because there's so much of a difference between the different observational products. So here is the results, or here's output from other satellites and the satellite simulators. On the top is the data. So again, notice that we have different time periods here. From ISKIP, this is the data that I was supplied with for these years, 2000, 2007. Calypso is this 10-year period here. And this is the total cloud fraction. So here we have a total cloud fraction, high clouds and low clouds, of 65. And here it's 67. So that's pretty good agreement. I mean, it'd be nice if it was even closer, but that's pretty good, especially when you see that the total cloud fraction from AM4 is actually, in the case of ISKIP, 15% lower. And in the case of Calypso, it's almost 12% lower. That's what these biases here on the far right are showing. These are the patterns, but the numbers I'm telling you are the global numbers, and the global numbers are sort of what you can focus on for the moment. So according to the simulators, we have different biases between the different satellite products, and they both show that the model is producing too few clouds. So now we were just looking at the ISKIP satellite product, and now this is also the MODIS product. Again, on the top we have output from the model, and on the bottom we have observations. So this is ISKIP. This is from the same satellite that this comes from here. This is from MODIS, which is a similar satellite product, but it does better with high clouds. And this is the ISKIP simulator, and this is the MODIS simulator. So this is all model data. One of the first things that jumped out at us when we looked at this is that there's a big difference between observational products. So this is, again, sort of frustrating, because if we wanted to say this is what we're going to do our best to get the model to produce clouds just like observations, and we took this, we'd get one answer. If we did that and we took this, we'd get a different answer. The output from the simulators of the two products actually look more similar to each other than the observational products do. So the way to approach this is to take the relative strengths and weaknesses of each product. There's similarity in the observational products and low-level clouds, and we can see that the low-level clouds, according to both measures, are underpredicted, and we know that MODIS does a better job with upper-level clouds, so we could put a little bit more confidence in these clouds here than these products here. So then here, if we look at more at the overall pattern, I focused my analysis mostly on the Calypso observations, because the Calypso observations allow us to look at low, medium, and high clouds in a way that's a little bit more direct than some of the other older satellite products. So here is the observations, and here's the bias. So this is the observations minus the model, observations minus the model, observations minus the model. So here you see the low-level clouds. We have here the stratocumulus cloud decks that are off the coasts of North and South America. You see all of the clouds in the Southern Ocean, and this is the mid-level cloud field. And then here you see your high clouds that are in the deep tropics, like deep cumulonimbus towers in this region over the Wormpool region and the ITCZ. So we see features that we expect to see, and then you can see the biases, how they break down, where we have almost 3% too few high clouds, almost 5% too few mid-level clouds, and then about 10% too few low-level clouds. What I think is more useful, and that we'll look at a little bit more in the context of other experiments, is looking at the zonal mean. The patterns, I think, are somewhat helpful because we can connect these patterns to features that we expect from the globe. But this shows us a little bit more directly what's happening with where the biases are. This also is encouraging a little bit. Here you see, so the solid line is the data, and then the dashed line is the model output. I think it's encouraging that the overall shape is correct. So this shape is correct. It's just shifted downward from the observations, and that's true of all of these ones, with a few exceptions. But maybe that's the primary encouraging point here, because overall we just see there's too few clouds, and especially in low levels, and especially right here. So I would say most of this bias is actually coming from between plus and minus 30. And if we get those clouds right, things would look much, much better in terms of the observational comparison. So that's the observational comparison. It's hard. It's kind of messy, and I've struggled to write up these results because I'm not a satellite expert. My familiarity is with the model, and so when I'm looking at these black boxes within a black box, there's a lot of detailed information about the satellites. And then even if I was a satellite expert, that doesn't mean I know exactly how the simulator works. The simulator is a piece of software that's plugged into the model, and the people that built the model don't know the simulator because they didn't build that. So there's a need for a lot of communication. And then as you can see, we go through these different ways of looking at clouds. There's differences between the observational results. So it's a little bit of a delicate issue to bring out the common features that we need to improve on, but I think it's possible. So overall, my impression is that the clouds in AM4, they're okay. There's a lot. We know that there are problems with clouds in global climate models, and if you look through the literature over the last 30 years, it's a sort of a recurring theme, especially with papers written by observationalists. They're sort of not that hard to get a lot of GCM data and point out how bad the clouds are and how bad the rain is. So we know that's the case. That's the case with AM4, but I think that it's sort of in the middle of it's middle of the road. It's okay. It's not terrible. It's not great, but it's okay. And we know that the top of the atmosphere flux is correct. So that tells us that the effect of the clouds is correct. We have too few clouds, but they're probably too bright, and that allows us to have a good energy balance. So that's the positive. The negatives we've gone over. There's too few clouds in all the comparisons. There's a struggle with these thin clouds. And we know that there's not enough stratocumulus cloud decks. That came forth out of multiple comparisons with the series data and with MODIS data, as well as with the Calypso data. And then there's this well-documented problem of what's too few, too bright is what it's called. It comes from initially this study in 2012. That should be NAM, not NAME. But anyways, their models have too few clouds, but the clouds are brighter than they should be. And so that allows you to get the correct radiative effect. It's not something we intentionally put into the models, but it's sort of how the model responded. And that is still the case. So now if we go towards the second part of this talk, we sort of have an idea now of what some of the problems with our clouds are, and also some of the things that are good about the clouds, or some of the strong points. But what we were initially interested in is what the sensitivity of Earth's climate is to increased greenhouse gas concentrations. This is a very simple question. That's part of the appeal of the question, in my opinion, is that it's so simple, but we've struggled for so long to figure it out. And I think actually the jury is still out on how simple the answer even will be of what the sensitivity is. So how do we measure the sensitivity? There's a lot of different ways to measure it that I'll talk about. How do we compute it, and how do we predict it? What we really want is to be able to predict it, right? We want to know if we're putting a bunch of stuff into the atmosphere, what's going to happen, and how extreme will it be, if at all. So there's these different methods. To measure and observe it, we simply just look at the temperature records. We can look at proxy data. We can compute it in a lot of different ways. This energy budget method has been quite common, and that's been used to look at the current historical period of time and try to estimate the climate sensitivity. And then there's this, what many call assessed feedback. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we also can use coupled model experiments. And so we're going to look at the clouds and the coupled model experiments. And then how do we predict it? There's, as I mentioned, the energy budget method. There's a regression method that is used a lot. I'll give you some numbers from that. And then there's longer coupled simulations that are also used. And so these give different results. And so we have to be able to interpret these accordingly. And what I'm interested in is how do clouds influence the different results that you get from these questions. The different results come from these different complications where we have to define equilibrium carefully. There's anthropogenic and natural changes to the climate system that have happened over the last century or two. And there's also multiple interacting feedbacks and variability. So we analyzed clouds according to the observations from the AMIP experiment, where we put into the model the sea surface temperatures and the sea ice that was observed. Now we're going to look a little bit at the historical experiment. The historical experiment is similar in that we give the model the prescribed carbon dioxide concentrations and the volcanic, solar, and other anthropogenic forcings. So we give it the atmospheric concentrations, but then we have also a fully dynamic ocean. And so the sea surface temperatures are not prescribed, they're calculated. And so then we can actually use this model to see, does it follow the observed historical record? And you can, as you imagine, just run it on longer if you want to and see what happens in the future. So this is a way of seeing how good of a fit to the historical record our model does. The black and the gray are two different observed temperature records. So this is what nature actually did. And the red, there were 3 different ensembles we ran with no meaningful difference between the 3 different ensembles. And the thick line is the ensemble mean. The red is what the coupled model experiment did. So there's this big difference here that we can talk about more if you want to. One of the things to note here, though, is that they start at the same point and they finish at the same point. So if your only measure of the success of this historical simulation is the temperature change over the last 150 years, the model did great. But this is sort of problematic and this is sort of disturbing because you see actually that for a lot of this, the model wasn't warming very much at all. And the model was really not warming nearly as much as observations. And then in the last few decades, it really spiked up. And so this was concerning. And this is the focus of this paper that's almost finished by Mike Winton. It's not almost finished, it's almost published. So if you want to know the CO2 forcing, what you can do is you can run the model exactly the same, but keep the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere fixed at pre-industrial levels. That's what the blue line here shows. And when you get to the end of the run, this is still at about 0, which means all of the warming in the model was more or less due to carbon dioxide. A lot of the other things they're still active, but they're canceling each other out. The only difference between these 2 lines is the carbon dioxide concentration. We also know that aerosols provide a significant cooling on the atmosphere and also land use change over the last 150 years. So those are cooling the system down. And if we want to know how much those are cooling the system down, we can fix those in the model at pre-industrial values. And if we fix those 2 measures of cooling the system down, this is what we get. So if you take out the cooling effect of aerosols and land use change, the system warms up twice as much. So this is, I think this is fascinating how dramatic of a difference those factors make. Anyways, I mentioned the energy budget method as one method that people use to estimate the climate sensitivity of Earth. And the energy budget method looks at observations over this type of period and then tries to sort of project those into what would happen. They look at the forcing of carbon dioxide during an observed period of time and the temperature change that we've seen, and they infer then what the climate sensitivity is. That method has some issues, and in particular has some issues with this model because this model warms up so fast at the end. So we'll talk about why this is warming up so quickly. So I went over those. So what does this tell us about the ability to predict the climate sensitivity? As I mentioned before, CM4 is the coupled model. That's the red line. It's consistent with observations in the sense that it finishes at the same temperature. I mean, the temperature difference between beginning and end is the same as observed. It's consistent. Its ocean heat uptake is consistent with observations, and its radiative forcing is also consistent with observations. But the model, when we look at other experiments, is very sensitive. The model has a climate sensitivity. I'll mention where we get this number in the future in a few slides of 5 Kelvin. So it's a pretty high sensitivity model. And what this is telling us is that the historical experiment is not enough to constrain the climate sensitivity. We just can't really pull out what the sensitivity is from this experiment. And part of it is because these 2 factors are counteracting each other, and we don't know either of these as precisely as we would like to in a way that would enable us to really figure out how to match the historical record. So we need more information than just the historical simulation. So a separate method for estimating climate sensitivity. I find it interesting to be here because this is where Robert Sess was for many years. So I imagine some of you here, but probably not many of you, knew him or were around when he was still here. he really was a leader in this field, and so even as early as the early 70s, he was aware of how important clouds and radiative fluxes were to the climate sensitivity question. So there's an enormous amount of papers that he wrote that were very influential in this area of study. These two papers in particular have had a big impact in the modeling community, because in these two papers, he did one of the first atmospheric intercomparisons where they established that clouds were one of the primary sources of spread in the climate sensitivity. So they took the models as best as they had at that time in the late 80s, and they were able to show from that the clouds were having a huge impact. The other thing that came from these papers that has had a large footprint is that he developed this simple and cheap methodology to use SST as a surrogate for climate change. So rather than changing the carbon dioxide, what he proposed to do is simply add a uniform warming to the model and see what happens at the top of the atmosphere radiative flux. And so you can sort of back out what the climate sensitivity is from that. Even though you're putting in the sensitivity, when you look at the radiative fluxes, you can see how sensitive the atmosphere is. So what you do is you add a +2 or a +4 Kelvin warming uniformly to the surface. And the reason I'm going into this is because this is what modeling centers do. I don't know that they all still do it. Some of them do. GFDL still does. And I know in the past many of them did, where they're developing a model and they want to know how sensitive it is, and they do this type of experiment. It's very cheap, it's very easy, and it tells you what they think the sensitivity will then be of that climate. And you can think about that in terms of how you're developing the model. This has become problematic, though, for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit more, basically because of things that the clouds are doing and how clouds complicate the picture. So then the other method of sensitivity, or another two more methods of calculating the sensitivity, is one was sort of highlighted here by this paper by Timothy Andrews in 2012, and this is what ended up being used for the IPCC AR5 report. So this had a really large influence, and what they did is they looked at the first 150 years of the abrupt carbon dioxide 4 times CO2 experiment, and they did a regression analysis, and they estimated the climate sensitivity from that. So this goes back to this paper by Gregory in 2004. You increase carbon dioxide by 4 times, you do a regression analysis, and they make various arguments to say that that's a good estimate of what your equilibrium climate sensitivity actually is. And this has become a sort of a standard way of doing it. So this gives us numbers. It's a simple, relatively cheap way of getting a number. There's lots of other studies, though. This one by David Paintner et al. Is one of them that show that a coupled climate model needs thousands of years to equilibrate. And we know this. I think many people all over the field know this. And if you do this and you find the real sensitivity after thousands of years, it's much higher than is found with this method. So in our case here with these two models, it was about a whole degree warmer than was estimated here. So the IPCC report, the way that is computed, we know that it's flawed. Timothy Andrews knows it's flawed. He's written all about this. There's a lot of information out, but this is sort of the standard way of doing it, and I think they're still doing it that way. So this is another methodology of computing things, and it's because of the adjustments in the first 20 to 50 years. And it's largely due to clouds. It's largely due to low-level clouds, in fact. So this has a big impact. We know that it's problematic, but this way of computing sensitivity is just too expensive. We can't run all of our climate models out for 5,000 years to see what they do. So I'm going to put all this together in a moment, and I'm going to try to illustrate how clouds influence the various computations of sensitivity. But this is coming back to the SES method, or the SES feedback parameter. That's what this number corresponds to. And it was really closely tracked in the GFDL development stage. And AM2 had a sensitivity that they thought was more realistic than the AM3, so they were trying to drive the SES sensitivity to a number kind of similar to this, and they succeeded. AM4, the SES feedback parameter is 0.57, which is only a little bit more than AM2, and the inference is that it's going to then have a climate sensitivity similar to AM2, not similar to AM3. This turned out to not be the case. When you actually run the model out, AM4 is actually as sensitive or more than AM3. So this is sort of a puzzle of why that is the case. So the SES feedback method assumes that your feedback is constant in time, or it assumes that using this constant method that your surface pattern doesn't matter and that your feedback is not going to change in time. And these are two studies that recently came out that have shown that this is not the case. And this also has been known for quite a while, but these are studies showing that the feedback parameter actually varies dramatically, just even on a decade scale. So in this paper here, we showed pretty clearly that this variation is due to clouds, and it's due to low-level clouds. So this feedback, what this is saying is that the actual pattern of the warming matters, and it matters because of how the low-level clouds respond to the pattern of warming. And so you get all this decadal variability in the feedback. So where this line is here influences how much your climate sensitivity is in that particular model. And you see it's higher and lower in different places. And this is the measure of the cloud feedback. And you see that for the particular models used here, the cloud variability of feedback tracks very well with the overall feedback of the climate system. So here, putting together some of those things that we were just talking about, we have these different models, and we have these different ways of communicating or calculating the feedback. And what you can focus on to understand the point is just AM3, for example, where we have these different numbers due to the SES feedback. This is the transient climate response. This is the effective climate sensitivity. This was computed in the Andrews et al. Way of the first 150 years. If you do the same method, but you look at it for a longer time period, you get a different number. And then this is the actual equilibrium sensitivity going out thousands and thousands of years. So the method matters a lot. And so this idea that the climate sensitivity is just a simple number that you can get is simply not true. There's not necessarily a problem with that as long as communication is clear. The problem is that people mix up all of this terminology. And so this sometimes is called ECS, this is called ECS, this is called ECS, and this is called ECS. And that's the problem. So if the communication was better, then it would be a lot easier to know what's happening. So this is showing us that the climate sensitivity varies just based on the methodology. And that is largely due to low-level clouds. Another thing that we can do is we can look at a hierarchy of models. And we can say, as we look at different experiments at different complexity, can we say something consistent about climate sensitivity? So radiative convective equilibrium is a simple system that doesn't rotate. It mostly just focuses on the interaction between the clouds and the radiation. We've learned a lot from those types of systems in the last 20 years, and you can compute a climate feedback in a system like this. This is a paper that Kevin did a while ago. With Aqua Planets, well, actually, before I go to Aqua Planets, this is radiative convective equilibrium, but that's just simply rotating. So then you get things that look more like tropical cyclones, and you can compute feedbacks and cloud feedbacks with that type of an experiment. We can also use Aqua Planets, which go up significantly in complexity from these two systems. Really, the only difference from an Earth-like system is that the tilt is usually taken away and there's no land. But you have similar sea surface temperatures, you have rotation, you have the same size of planet usually as Earth. And then this would be something like the AMIP experiment or the historical experiment. So you can compute a climate sensitivity with all of these models. You can do like assess feedback methodology with all of these models, and you can learn something about how the clouds influence that. The problem until recently has been that an individual model usually can't run in all these different configurations. I'm going way too slow, so I'm going to speed up, and then hopefully we can have questions. But there's several different models now that can do this whole hierarchy of systems, and so we're sort of at a new point where we can start to look at this in a unified way. So here, this is an old paper by Ringer et al., and what he's looking at is a sort of hierarchy of models and the feedback at the top of the atmosphere. These are Aqua Planet experiments, these are AMIP experiments, and then this is the 4 times CO2 experiment. So these are using the SES method of computing the feedback, and this is using a regression method that came from Gregory. And what you see is that across these different configurations, there's a lot of variation in what the feedback at the top of the atmosphere is. And if you break that down into, this is the shortwave cloud feedback, so this is often attributed to low-level clouds. There's quite a bit of variation here. This is the long-wave cloud feedback. There's less variation there. And then this is shortwave clear. I'm not going to say much about this except that the red dots show where AM4 falls in this, so we know it's at least in the same ballpark as CMIP5 models. That's what the blue is indicating. And we also can see from the different types of hierarchies of models, Some of them have ice, some of them don't, and so that influences the shortwave clear sky feedback. So we can explain a lot of this variation just due to the setup of the models, and that allows us to then back out how much is due to clouds. So here, now I'm going to kind of try to combine the first part of the talk and the second part of the talk and just look at some cloud profiles and see what we can learn about how the GFDL model is functioning in comparison to the different warming experiments and the historical. The black line is the Calypso data from the satellite, and this is the upper level clouds. And the sort of brownish line is AMIP. So you've already seen this in previous plots, but what's new is the historical experiment, which is the coupled experiment that's a little bit more of a rigorous test for the model. And the first question you could ask is coupling the model to a dynamic ocean going to bring the clouds closer to what we observe? And the first order answer is no, it doesn't. The clouds are very, very similar between the coupled model with the dynamic ocean and just the atmosphere-only model. There are differences, and I would say these differences do matter, but it's still closer to the atmospheric model and not the observations. And that's true in the high levels, the mid levels, and the low levels, except for up here in the northern latitudes. So now we can look at just warming experiments. So we have a CES experiment, the AMIP plus 4K, and then we have sort of the two very traditional CMIP warming experiments. One is the abrupt 4 times CO2. This is where the ECS is almost always computed from. And then a 1% CO2, which is gradually increasing the CO2 concentration until you get warming. And we can look at how the clouds change there relative to the AMIP experiment. And what we see is that they change, we have more clouds at the upper levels in all of those cases. And then if we look at high, middle, and low level clouds, we see what is, I say here, basically it's a little bit unimpressive until you look at differences. So we're going to look at differences in a moment, but I just want to point out that there's this bump here and this dip here, which is indicating how the coupled models really do differ from the atmosphere-only model. So this is part of the influence of having an interactive surface and a dynamic ocean. And we'll see what that looks like here, where I've just taken the differences relative to AMIP. And here the coupled experiments really jump out in terms of what the low-level clouds are doing. And so we see that there's much more of a ITCZ, the intertropical convergence zone in the southern hemisphere for both of those models. And the low-level clouds, there's far fewer low-level clouds in the northern latitudes for these two models. There's also big differences in the high-level clouds related to the tropics. In the Southern Ocean, the clouds really jump quite a bit in the coupled models. So these are really significant differences. And we've seen that the sensitivity of the model is quite different with the different methodologies of computing the sensitivity. And in particular, when we go out to longer periods of time, or we look at the abrupt warming experiment and compare it to the CES experiment, there's a big difference. And I would argue that this is a big part of where that difference is coming from. Because the CES-like experiment of just a uniform warming, that's what this light green line here would be. But the more traditional method of computing the climate sensitivity would come from these models that have a large difference in their tropical and high latitude clouds. And this is the figure that I was just highlighting here. And this one is it's the same type of figure, but it has the historical experiment put onto here as well, so that you can see, you can see how different the historical clouds are compared to the other coupled experiments that are warming. And so this is showing us that there's a huge difference in how the model clouds respond at longer time periods with strong forcing than in the historical time period. So what this does is it helps to explain what's often called the pattern effect, where the models don't warm up as much as we think that they should in the last couple of decades. But then when you look at longer-term projections from the climate models, they're really much, much warmer than we would infer from the observations. And this is showing that there's a pretty dramatic difference in the low-level clouds between those two different experiments. So I have two conclusion slides. This is the first one. This is sort of broad, not connected to the GFDL models. Well, I'll go through it first, and then I'll say one or two things. So what I think is very important is that we need to develop a consensus on the cloud constraints that the model developers actually will use. And people get kind of feisty about this sometimes. If I talk to somebody who's more familiar with the satellites, they'd say, well, we have all of it. You know, we know what the clouds are. We have the satellite data. Just use it. And I talked to somebody at GFDL, and you know, they don't trust the satellite data for good reasons. I mean, the satellite data is data that tells us something, but it's different than the next satellite. And so we have to know how to do that, and it's going to involve a lot of communication. But what we really need is a cloud constraint that we can trust that model developers will actually use, and that'll help us make progress. The SES feedback does not provide a good estimate of the equilibrium climate sensitivity, but it's very useful. And I would say as we do these hierarchies of simplified modeling, I think a SES type experiment where you have uniform warming or uniform cooling is extremely important to test parameterizations or to see how clouds respond to simple changes. But in terms of a full-blown climate model, that's not going to tell you what the climate sensitivity is. And then the diversity of climate sensitivities can be really discouraging because the different methodologies give you different numbers, the different models give you different numbers, the different experiments give you different numbers. But there's points that we can pull out of this that we're starting to really be able to be confident about. And part of that is this, what's called the pattern effect, or what has become called the pattern effect. And that tells us that the sea surface temperature really makes a huge difference on how the overall system's responding, which shouldn't be that surprising when we realize how important something like El Nino is. But the clouds respond to that, and the clouds also feed back upon the sea surface temperatures, and that changes the overall net energy imbalance of the atmosphere. So paying attention to that could help us understand better how regional changes in the near future could influence warming or cooling in different places. I think I'm going to skip the GFDL-related conclusions because I've already said it all, and I'm just going to take questions.
Hi, I had a question about your number about 0.6 watts, the difference between incoming shortwave and OLR.
Mm-hmm.
How is that derived?
Well, first I will direct you to that paper because the paper was...
No action is needed. That's okay. Don't worry.
I'm glad I finished. The paper, I think it was from 2012. Graham Stevens was the lead author. It's derived in a quite complicated way, and so I think that the series data on top of the atmosphere fluxes, I think we know that to within 4 or 5 watts per meter squared. And what's kind of perplexing about getting uncertainties in the fluxes at the top of the atmosphere is that all the different products have different uncertainties, and they're all bigger than the uncertainty on that final number. And so I don't fully understand it myself, but I know that they use measurements of ocean heat uptake, and they use that to constrain part of the questions. They also look at the albedo and how well we understand the albedo. But a lot of the incoming and outgoing radiation is directly measured by satellites. So I think at the top of the atmosphere, we know much more precisely what the situation is than at the surface.
But the satellites depend. So if it's a satellite retrieval, you're dependent upon a radiation model to get the satellite retrieval.
Yeah.
And you're comparing with an absolute number, which is incoming shortwave, which is actually a physical number that we can measure quite well at TOA.
Yeah.
So I'm having a difficult time understanding how you can compare a number that might be precise, but you're actually comparing it to an actual number for incoming shortwave. The OLR then, of 0.6 watts, the difference, I don't see how you can get that number. How do you...
So, well, a couple of things. One is that that's a relatively short period of time. I think that those observations were over a 5 to 10 year window of time. So that imbalance, I would expect, would change decadally, not dramatically,
Sure.
but it could change some.
Sure.
I think we know the incoming solar radiation quite well,
Yep.
and it's the outgoing, the OLR.
Right.
But the reflected, I think, is a little bit more complicated. So I don't know if you're talking about the OLR itself or the net. The net is what the 0.6 was.
Yeah.
So I think he's talking about the comparison, right? So you could directly measure radiation from the sun, but right, that's a lot more of a...
To get the net, you got to get the OLR correct, and you have to get it correct on an absolute basis to compare with incoming shortwave TLA.
Yeah.
So I think what it tells you, I think if you go back to that, well, if we would be able to go back to the plot, right? It was 0.6 plus or minus 0.4, so it suggests that number is pretty uncertain up to 80%.
Which I would suggest is pretty conservative, but even if you are, I noticed that all of the models are converging towards 0.6, because you think you know what the answer is. So if the answer was 4, do you think you guys would shoot towards 4? Levi, I'm just trying.
No, I think the models. I think most of the models would be happy if they were less than 2, or less than 1. So because that 0.6 or 0.4, it changed with the different version of series that came out. What's interesting is that if you look at the surface, it was also 0.6 plus or minus 17. So the surface is a bit of a mess, and the surface is really interesting, and there have been updates to that. But that just tells you how much better or how much more confident we are at the TOA than at the surface.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Maybe all the way in the back, and then.
Yeah, you showed the climate difference, climate amount, cloud amount difference is about 4% and 17% in some beginning. Does that difference correspond to was it deficit of less than 1 water meter per square or 4.3?
Are you?
You show the cloud difference or bias, 4% or
17, yeah,
yes.
from the miser data.
Those differences correspond to the model you tuned later or before.
So those are not connected to the tuning necessarily. The tuning was done related to other variables, and that's just what the cloud was. That's the cloud that was produced for that given experiment.
That's after you tune the model.
Yeah.
The official CM4 version.
Yeah, but that's only for the low-level clouds. So yeah.
I think you were saying that they tuned the model to sort of reproduce the radiative balance or growth model. So my question is that I think Dr. S also has a paper that kind of looked at the data random variability, which I think Sullivan suggested maybe important, the ENSO variability, which is a big variability in the clouds, and he found that at that time the models were producing all the wrong things, and supposedly the radiative balance would be changed a bit between Salina and Reno because of the quite significant difference in cloud.
Yeah.
So did people actually use that kind of thing to sort of see whether the variability of the radiative budget in the model actually captures what's the variability in the model shown naturally?
Yeah, so it's a little bit, it's actually kind of probably like an obscene oversimplification to say it was tuned towards the series data, but I would say that was probably thought to be one of the most important variables we wanted to get right. The variability was also hugely important. So the whole model development process, they were looking at ENSO to see how strong is ENSO, what's the frequency occurrence of ENSO, what does the MJO look like, and so all these different measures of tropical variability were also very important, and that was one of the reasons that they didn't go crazy with cloud tuning and changing the entrainment, for example, or something like that with the deep convection, because they noticed that as they changed the clouds in some ways that might appear more realistic, some of the variability would get worse. And so the variability of the model, I think, was thought to be more important than an absolute cloud number, because the absolute cloud number is a little bit less precisely known. So the tropical variability was very important, and they looked at that a lot. There also, we also looked at the series top of the atmosphere radiative budget for the seasonal cycle, because there is quite a seasonal cycle of that, and that is matched pretty well in the model. So that doesn't speak to things like ENSO or the decadal variability, but it speaks to the seasonal variation of the top of the atmosphere radiative imbalance, and that was also a priority. So there were quite a few different things that were looked at for each of the different model versions, but the series data was just high priority. Was one way of thinking about it.
Just want to follow up. What I'm getting at is that because you're showing kind of the comparison with time quality only, but what I'm thinking about is that if the model actually don't get the cloud variability right, then how would you trust the model to get the cloud change?
Yep.
So instead of just looking at it may be biased, but it may have the correct variability. But that has to be demonstrated.
Yeah.
And you had that with the calculated feedback parameter, that's a function of time.
It depends on the method. So I mean, but the feedback parameter usually is averaging over a certain period of time. But some of the methods are more of a function of time. This is actually kind of an open question. Well, it's not an open question, but people have different opinions on whether or not the climatology of clouds is a totally separate issue or not. I've looked at some papers that seem to imply the climatology isn't that important. The change of the clouds with the warming experiment is what's important. I find that hard to believe. It seems like the climatology of clouds would be very important, and you want to get that first before you know how they're going to change under warming. But I think a lot of times the climatology is sort of ignored when people do feedback experiments with clouds.
Okay, so I think we'll finish up and we'll head to lunch. Just a reminder, there will be time at 1:45 for graduate students.